Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Art and Mind Village Chat. I'm Fred Johnson, a community engagement specialist and artist in residence here at the Straz Center for the Performing Arts, along with Miss Emma Trapp, our community engagement manager. We are excited to begin this new series of conversations around the importance of art in all of its forms in alignment with science and research, the health communities, for the health and well-being of individuals and communities, kind of reshaping our understanding of how we can include creativity in a process that is good for all of us. We do this in alignment with the International Institute for Art and the Mind at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. We're excited to partner with them. Usually, we would have a co-host from Johns Hopkins, but they're in the throes of doing magnificent work right now and have entrusted us to embrace this conversation today with two phenomenal folk, three phenomenal folk, four phenomenal folk, as we have a conversation that expands our arts and health conversation beyond just how good it is for individuals, but how powerful it can be for communities and for our world. We are honored to have uh, I'm so close to this until it's hard for me to step back and do the introductions. But the overarching conversation is about the insight approach to conflict transformation. Um, Honored to have Miss Viev Rada Price, who is also a member of our Arts and Mind uh, team, helping to develop our arts and health way forward in alignment with Taya Artistry. So welcome, Viev. So happy to have you here. And my first introduction to this amazing insight approach was in conversations with Viev Price when I was working in New York City. Honored to have both Jamie Price and Marnie Joe, two experts in the field of conflict transformation, and most specifically the insight approach. This triangle of folk have been involved in not only in the science and research and understanding of the insight approach, but also the application of the insight approach in relationship to theater. Viev is also the founder and artistic director of Taya Artistry, which is a theater company in New York City that both creates theatrical pieces and also educates and inspire folk to understand human behavior. So we'll get into that a little bit more. I'll start with Marnie. Marnie, would you just give us an overview of your work and your journey into the insight approach? I know that you are a phenomenal teacher, researcher, so just give us an overview, and then Jamie will go to you to give an overview, and then we'll move forward with the conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Fred. And I'm very happy to be here with Jamie and Viev and Emma and all of the people who are joining in the conversation with your individual experience and your thoughts and your minds. I am currently an associate professor at Royal Roads University, which is located in Victoria, Vancouver Island, which is on the farther west coast of what is called Canada, and the it's north of Seattle. I first became interested in the insight approach when I had worked in community development for several years, working against violence and poverty for women and their children, and moved into government where it was then trying to work on setting policy, where because it seemed to me that the individuals depend on the social systems, and the social systems depend on individuals making different kinds of decisions. But it didn't seem to me that we had a very good way of thinking about how can we develop policies that can shift the patterns of violence or the conditions of poverty. And how can we also sort of liberate the decision makers? And by liberate, I mean help them do their best thinking in a way that takes into account all the complexities. Meanwhile, I was also really involved in a theater company that did street theater and was really aware of the personal liberation that I felt, like just the freedom of learning to walk on stilts in a very cold part of Canada for a New Year's Eve festival. And the costumes and the magic of bringing people together for community theater was so inspiring. And so weaving that in, when I met Jamie and Viev in Ottawa in Canada, which is the capital city, we started having some long conversations about insight, and we were guided around the insight approach from a master practitioner named Cheryl Picard, who was a mediator. So that's where I'll end that part of the story and then pass it over to Jamie as a way of this quest that we've been on for several years. And I will say as well that as part of my research, I've written a book called um, The Anatomy of Everyday Arguments, which really looks in very detailed exploration of how does an argument get started and how does it dissipate? An interpersonal argument where it can be just about cleaning products between my partner and I, or on a more wide scale around two individuals within a very serious decision-making process that was going to affect hundreds of people. The conflict that erupted in a meeting was really going to derail that process. And that how does it shift so that people can collaborate, so that those hundreds of people can actually move forward in a much more positive and concerted way. And so we did find that there's themes of the arts, of conflict, and of shifting people towards a more collaborative process that really the insight approach has a lot of answers to. Over to you, Jamie.
That's great. Jane?
Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Marnie. And for me too, it's a pleasure to be here, be with you, to be on this forum, which I've followed for the last couple of years. It's been wonderful. My entry into insight probably begins formally with when I was in graduate school at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, when I got to begin to explore the work of Bernard Lonergan. He's the philosopher theologian whose work is at the root of the insight approach. He wrote a big fat book called Insight, which is how the term insight translates into our work. But I didn't actually get involved in insight and conflict analysis until I had the opportunity about 20 years ago to become the executive director of a new organization, which was the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute. And my task there was to figure out how Sargent Shriver, who started the Peace Corps and the War on Poverty in the United States, and did more in the mid 20th century to build peace than arguably many other Americans at the time, certainly some presidents at the time. And how he did what he did, how he created the programs he created. And so like Marnie, I had bottom-up questions. There was this performance, and the issue was, how do we understand what's going on there? How can we do more of that? And Lonergan's approach was a guide for me. And Lonergan's approach basically is to pay attention to what we're doing when we're using our consciousness. And my background was in philosophy of consciousness and spirituality, and so I paid attention to Shriver's achievements, and like Marnie, wrote a book on the basis of that. It's called The Call, The Spiritual Realism of Sargent Shriver. But it led me into an understanding of the relationship of consciousness and art and symbol and all different other kinds of carriers of consciousness. And that leads us into the artistic realm with such power and connection, I think.
Great. So in this overarching conversation about art and health and well-being. How do we enter in, like how does the insight approach apply to individuals? What is it? I mean, what does it do? How does it, what are the nuts and bolts of this practice or this understanding called insight?
You want me to take the first cut at that and have Marnie fix it? What does it do? It really provides a framework, or more properly, a model for thinking about the questions you just raised, for thinking about the relationships you just raised. And it helps us to recognize that, in Lonergan's words, we have minds and we use them. And that if we pay attention to that, a lot of questions can be answered. So the main things are that is to notice, according to the insight approach, that there's a certain pattern flow to our mind, to our consciousness. And that it isn't just a random flow, but that it's carried by various things, and art is one of them. That when you have an experience of art, the insight approach helps us to distinguish what the artistic mode is and how it is working on our minds. What's it leading us to pay attention to? What questions is it causing? What sorts of feelings is it arising? Where does it take us with regard to our self-awareness, or does it take us away from our self-awareness? So the key thing about the insight approach is to pay attention to that relationship between the pattern flow of consciousness and the way it's being carried by particular art. And the way it links to conflict or transcending conflict is the recognition that when we're engaged in conflict behavior, a couple of things go on. One is that we experience a threat, we experience some sort of affective response to the situation we're in, and we reject that. We're afraid of it. We move from it, and then it turns into conflict behavior when we decide to deal with or to respond to those threats or fears or gaps or disappointments or that are showing up. And art, of course, is wonderful at dealing with those kinds of things. Art will portray in film, art will portray in photographs, art will portray in theater the kinds of conflicts we have. It'll also tell the stories of people who transcend them. So it enables us to pay attention, not only, to give us examples of how our minds are working and in particular situations.
Great. Let me just before I send it to you, Marty. So I think one of the first things that we're identifying, or I think I heard you say, is that like theater or art, it has a way of giving us an example. And for me, that it's like a commonality thing, right? It's like, in other words, we can watch a piece of theater or we can watch a film and we can relate to what's going on. The thing that was really exciting to me when I first was introduced to the insight approach is that fact, in other words, that pattern of deciding is the same in everybody, regardless of our cultural backgrounds, whatever. We may have different conversations going on in our head, but that process of deciding, or that process of how that cycle works, is common to everyone. Am I correct in saying that, Marnie?
Yeah, so that's such a nice way of adding on about culture and the importance of culture, which is what Jamie was talking about, is how there's an inner way of how we know and we value and we decide in a way that, like in the anthropology of ethics, it's really been well established that as a species, we are evaluative. People value, things matter, they have significance. And what's cultural is what has significance, or what matters, or how does it matter, and what we do when things matter. And so there's a cultural part, and then there's an individual part that we're all knowing and valuing and deciding. And we're doing that in relationship, and that we're very social as people. Even the idea of separating art from anything else is a kind of a strange thing, because in many cultures, there is not that divide between art and life, and bringing together, so that the things that we wear and the way that we talk and how we sing or don't sing are all very cultural. And so that when we think about art even being separate, we know that that's a kind of a social thing. When we're even talking about like bringing art back in some way, how did we lose that? So these are the kinds of questions. And who is the we that we're talking about? I mean, I think that's also super important, because in families, in individuals, that isn't lost in some places. So there is being very thoughtful about who is the I and who are the we, is for me one of the gifts of the insight approach, which has this inner dimension of how I come to know and value and decide and make decisions in relation to people. And also, as Jamie was saying, that those things are carried, that there's social narratives that get picked up about what has meaning, what is true, how do we be together? And those are very social and specific. And where I think it's quite cool about insight artistry is that there's a way, and the insight method is a way of, there's techniques and practices that help us pay attention to what I'm doing with my mind as I know and value and decided, how constricted and kind of self-referenced I am, or threat-based, or how open to others I might be, or how curious I might be. And I can also pay attention to other people's minds in that process. Viev is a master of developing collaborative relationships, which is really the core of art. Because another thing that it seems like very particular in certain cultures is that somehow art is seen as an individual activity. So that even when I'm writing my book, I'm talking to people, I'm influencing and influenced by other people. Those ideas are coming into the page. There's no individual artist. There's no individual mind at work. It's very social. So there's an individual component, but it's in relation. And so being able to pay attention to both what's happening in my mind, having some kind of like not even critical control, but an ability to actually be in relationship with what's going in my mind, that I have a way of having these internal conversations about what matters to me, what is that significance, what might be driving my decisions, what are my options. Those are great questions that are very honed through the practice of insight method. And then to be able to engage, like, what is my role within this particular context? How do I act in that role in a way that can help other people fulfill their roles more fully? How do we set up conditions for other people to be their best selves, rather than a kind of restricted version of themselves that can sometimes feel like it's demanded in a role? Where are the limits that are fixed, and where can we actually expand more? Those kinds of questions are extremely important. And having a method is really, for me, very important, because it provides a continual reference point to come back to when I kind of get a little bit lost in feeling like I'm not really sure what to do next, or get lost in some of the complexity. Then having a method to come back to sort out, okay, how do I actually think about this? What is the way to think about it so I can discover new possibilities? It's extremely useful both in day-to-day decision making, as well as in that artistic way of being, and certainly in seeing and participating and being part of an audience. Those are all the same kind of, I'm still using my mind, I'm still in community, I'm still absorbing narratives and being a part of a narrative myself, as I am engaged in being a part of an artistic experience.
I guess this question is for Marnie, Jamie, and Viev. Have you all found that by teaching this method, that it has empowered individuals, or it has empowered groups to shift or shift how they react? I mean, by teaching the methodology, have you been able to see where it has demonstrated that because someone understands that, they kind of maybe step back and function in a different way, and it enriches and enhances their sensitivity to what they're thinking and doing, and how that's having an impact on others? What have been some of the outcomes?
Yeah. Do you mind if I say a quick thing first before the two of you go forward on this one. I think that's a really great question, Fred, and I was reflecting on it in relation to the things that Marnie was saying too. It's critical that we know we have a mind and use it. And the thing that the insight approach helps us to do, and Marnie was illustrating this, and your question goes to it, is to become aware of the fact that we have a mind, to become aware of the fact that it has a pattern, to become aware of the fact that it's carried in all the kinds of ways that Marnie was talking about. And if we gain that kind of self-possession or that self-awareness or that self-appropriation, as some people like to call it, then we know whether or not we're using our mind well or poorly. And there's a certain drive within consciousness that all of us want to use our minds better than not. We'd rather understand than be confused. We'd rather get it right than not. We would rather be responsible than irresponsible. And so there's this inherent drive. It's where we encounter spirit, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But the key thing is that art, and this is what Viev has been so brilliant about, art can help us to become aware of this. I mean, lots of arts make us feel things. They make us feel horrible. They make us feel excited. They make us feel romantic. They make us feel, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have these feelings, but that doesn't mean we necessarily know we have them or what to do with them. We just experience them and we go on a great adventure with art, or we're moved profoundly. But the kind of art that enables us to become self-aware, become self-possessed, become critically, Marnie didn't want to use this word, but there's a certain way in which it works, discriminative. We can discriminate between the kind of art that's helping us to become more fully ourselves, more fully engaged with who we intrinsically want to be, and art that helps us, that moves us away from that, is crucial in the healing dimension, I think. And that's all I wanted to say. There's intrinsic in what Marnie was saying and what you're getting at, Fred, that to the theory of change that's operative in the insight approach, which I think is really profound. And you were asking, do people actually change? And I think the answer is yes. And Marnie and Viev can respond to that.
Yeah, I would love to just continue with Jamie, what you're saying and the question you asked, Fred, and Marnie, the wonderful narrative that you were creating just then, which is just that, Jamie, what you were saying in terms of people changing, that we know from our own experience that the moment that someone tells you what you should feel, tells you what you should think, shames you into something, there's that, it doesn't work. So Fred, when you ask, like, when people learn and are exposed to the insight approach or insight method, what happens? And I think that very move of kind of turning it back and wondering about ourselves. Oh my goodness.
Kaboom. How did you do that? Or did Emma do that for you?
That was profound. This taping will go down in history.
I don't know what that was, but it really, really punctuated and
it was perfect.
It was the artistic move.
Exactly. If you move all those questions, if you kind of wonder about yourself, if you're asked, what is happening? What is important? What matters to me? What's significant? What am I caring about? What am I worried about? Like, that exploration, that investigation is so profound, so dramatic. And it's really quite, it's really quite artistic too, right? So you get so much information about the very nature of our humanity. And then if you're in a group of people who are doing that, who are asked to do that in concert with each other, then you have, to speak to what Marnie and Jamie were saying, you have a method of doing that exploration communally. And in fact, with Taya, we take that exploration within the artist company, but also we go out into the community and ask those same kinds of questions to people, depending on what we're working on, the inner dynamics of race, or being Muslim and non-Muslim post 9/11. It's like really attending to people in their own terms about what is mattering to you about this thing now. And you get these really profound answers you could never anticipate, right? You get these stories you could never make up yourself, and you can bring them back into this company of artists and then work with those those nuggets, those stories, those themes, those issues that have come up in these insight conversations. And you have also a way of doing that because you have attended to your own meaning making, right? So it's not just content out there as free flowing content, but there's a particular method of how to then attend to these stories, how to attend to the things that you've learned from the community and from each other. So the answer, that was a long-winded and a very punctuated with fireworks way of saying, yes, I think it really does work, change the individual, and remove some of the biases and obstacles to communally creating art and healing together.
That's great. That's great. Marty?
So I think of the students that I have who have entered into a 2-year program on conflict and change making, and they come from all areas. And each one of them has come with some kind of quest, really, to explore more. And they're doing a master's degree. And what they leave with is a much deeper sense of connection with how they move through the world and how they impact others. They're able to get feedback and be able to offer feedback in a way that can shift a pattern of interaction. And really, with the kinds of questions that Viev was talking about, you can't not change. If it's like having a conversation with a good friend, when you're open to being changed and open to offering your own point of view in a way that can help someone else see themselves different or see themselves better, then those become the moments that they're the building blocks of different ways of moving and being in the world. And even when I find myself being rigidly certain and rigidly unartistic, there's a way in which by being open to the wondering within myself, being open to listening to the still small voice that we have come to call the principle of spirit, that is more opening and more imaginative, or even offering another possibility that I hadn't thought of before. Just being present to the possibility of spirit working within me and amongst others, that unleashes a lot of opportunities for something better. And that something better doesn't have to be defined. It's emergent. And that is really the process of artistry, isn't it? Is being open to multiple interpretations, being open to multiple ways of being in a way that is more authentic for the individuals and communities involved.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. So let's take a stab at doing Insight 101. Jamie, I love that what you said about us recognizing that we have a mind. I think many of us just take for granted, yeah, I've got a brain, it's up there, it kind of works. I don't know how it works. I don't know what goes on with it, but it works until it doesn't. So what's this? What's Insight 101 for, someone who's never heard of this before? Can you take us through a simple process so that we can understand how this, you all have described it as this deciding process? Take us through a level that can be generally understood by
Okay, I'll do one thing, and then Viev and Marnie can add another. I think the basic thing, or the first thing that happens in Insight 101, is that we ask people to distinguish between their use of their senses and what they experience through senses, through touch, through smell, through sight, through hearing, through taste, and the experience of their consciousness. What we find is that there are two different empirical. There's also a spiritual one too, but just to stay at the basic one, that there are two empirical data flows that work in us all the time, the way our senses are going and the way our consciousness is going. And if you can begin to distinguish those and begin to pay attention to notice your mind at work, and you notice that you can't see that, you can't taste that, you can't smell it, you can't really touch it, but you're experiencing it anyway, and you become at home with paying attention to that. Then what you discover next, in Insight 101, because we set up exercises to have people discover it, is that there is a pattern flow to the mind. And the pattern flows in kind of a double helix loop, which combines what we're doing when we're knowing and is augmented by what we're then doing when we're acting on what we know. And knowing, as you know from the scientific world, is really a matter of experiencing something, getting an insight into it, understanding it, and then confirming whether it's true or not. So there are those three basic moves that we do in various ways every day, all the time: experiencing, understanding, and verifying. And then once we say, oh, this is going on, or this is happening, we move into a second part of what we think of the loop, another set of operations. The next one is valuing. Marnie mentioned this earlier. Valuing is the answer to the question. I mean, we move from what is it to is it so, to what's the significance of this? What's my felt sense of this? And that's the discerning of the significance of what's going on for us. And we move spontaneously from there into sort of a problem-solving mechanism that's in our mind, that's built into our minds, which is, well, what are my options? What could I do in response to this? And then we narrow that down and evaluating to say, well, what should I do? What's the best thing to do here? And then we go to, will I do it? Will I decide to do it? So there's a flow of experiencing, understanding, verifying, valuing, deliberating, evaluating, and deciding. That is Insight 101. And that flow, as I said earlier, is carried in all sorts of ways. And this comes with the complexity of you look out at the stars, you see all the stars and all the constellations, and sometimes you know constellations, sometimes you don't. The inner life is kind of like that. There's a lot going on, and it's hard to map it. But what the Insight approach is to map it, but you have to get the basic database first to orient your questions. So that's part one of Insight 101. It's kind of, it may have sounded abstract in the way I was talking about it, but it's actually quite exciting to pay attention to yourself and to say, oh, that's what I do. That's how I do it. Oh, I didn't do that very well right then. Or I could do that better. Or I did. I get it. Yay, I get it.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because so I'll come at this another way too, because so Jamie, Viev, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about activities and exercises, and along with our colleague Megan, the activities can be a sort of starting with an assertion of, I'm shocked that my daughter was cut from the hockey team, or my roommate is a slob. And so there's a set of questions that can really, like, every time help to understand more about, oh, what specifically does your roommate do that leads you to say they're a slob? So right there, we're actually trying to distinguish, like, what's the sort of significance and the feeling, and what's the kind of actual sort of sensory data that you can see and feel, or that you can see and touch. So my roommate is a slob. Okay, they never do the dishes. Right. So now we have a better sense of, like, what's going on in the actual sort of the sensory world. Never does the dishes. So now there's a felt response to that. What's the significance of that to you? He thinks I'm a maid, or we might get cockroaches. So there's some kind of concern that's going on. So now we're into valuing. Okay. So we're already in those two questions. We have way more than, gee, another sort of a typical common sense response would be, my roommate's a slob too, or that's too bad. Maybe you should move out. So there's a common sense response, and then there's an insight response. And they're very different in the way that they help you with precision to be able to understand more about what's going on and what some of the options might be. Over to you, Bev.
Well, and one of the things in terms of the investigation, as I used the word before, but into kind of the piece around, like, okay, your roommate's a slob. What do? They leave the dishes in the sink. And what's your felt response to that? Well, so this is the part where it's like, you can never really guess what the threat or what the gap is. I may say, oh my God, we're going to get cockroaches. I can imagine you hate that roommate because who wants cockroaches? And you're there thinking like, oh, I never even thought about cockroaches. Well, first of all, thanks a lot. Now I've got cockroaches in my head, but I'm also, but actually what I was thinking is they're such a jerk because like I'm always cleaning up and I'm supposed to be their roommate, not their maid. So it's this, and it's like this, we can never really know what the, again, this gap or threat or what's happening in that space between sort of like my roommate's, my roommate's a slob and the actual, like, what's this huge narrative that's going on? And that's part of, for me, such a huge part of the excitement of creating art together, because that really finding those different narratives that are being spun, those different dramas that are happening in our minds, and then what we want to do about them, right? If you're a friend and the friend says, my roommate's a slob, well, then you should move out. It's very truncated. It's actually not that interesting. As you sort of open it all up, it becomes like, whoa, look at this world we have in front of us and within us to create art with and from.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think in a lot of the experiences that I've had in my life out in the world, using, art to try to help to create conversation or to create new experiences for people. And, full disclosure, I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with Viev and Jamie and Marnie around the Insight approach, and as a sort of an actualizing artist. And I think we talk about this a lot in the work that Emma and I do here at the Straz too, is that in terms of really just engaging with the community, okay? Two really important things it feels like as an artist to be cognizant of when you're communicating or connecting to people is how are they making meaning? How are they, you know what I mean? It's like how, 5 different people could have the same experience and they all feel a different way about it. So how are you making meaning? And in many areas of conflict, or even when people are even reluctant to talk to us, it's that they've shut their curiosity down. So that curiosity is a really important thing. And of course, in this pattern, if you will, of how do we decide, how do we act upon things, it's how we make what we believe, you know what I mean, how we come to believe and how we make meaning, which colors a lot of our communal experiences, that either, allows us to move closer together, be curious about each other, move closer together, or, we've already made up our mind about, they wear certain things, or they must be, or they whatever. So shifting from the individual journey to the communal journey is when we, if as art, in whatever art we're using, if we can move closer to creating spaces of curiosity, of like, wow, man, I like the way that sounds, I wonder what that is, wow, that looks different, I've never seen that before, or man, I would have said the exact same thing if I'm watching a play. And to me, that helps to creatively define the spirit or the breadth of how we are with each other, right? The breadth of the spaces that we make together. Or even if Emma and I go into a community and we're engaging with a group for the very first time, in that curiosity of listening and being, it helps us to understand, I think, and Emma, you're the social worker, so I'll ask you to expound upon this. If I go into a community that I haven't been in before and I listen and I'm engaged with those folk, it's sort of getting a sense and a feeling, being curious about their space, who they are, what am I hearing, what are common and uncommon things, helps me to shape the questions that I want to ask, as opposed to the decisions that I want to make about who they are, is the questions that I want to ask. I mean, Emma, you've had a lot of experience as a social worker, working oftentimes in situations where people are living challenging lives. I mean, does this concept and this idea of insight, can you feel elements of commonality there?
Yeah, absolutely. I can. I think one of the things that we really try to do, especially when engaging, for example, with the veteran community and trying to bridge that gap between the veteran community and the civilian community, is a lot of people feel like, okay, you're listening to what I'm saying, but are you hearing me? You're listening, but you're not hearing what I'm saying. You're not thinking about it in a more complex way, and I think that having that understanding of your personal experience is going to shape the way that you process or the way that you speak or those kinds of things, and understanding why you're reacting the way that you're reacting um, is really beneficial. But one of the things that we really try to do in these and building trust is to just listen, but then hear. Listen, but hear. And that's a huge thing. And that's something that I say very often is, okay, especially when I'm explaining something to somebody and I say, okay, well, what did you, I think a big thing too is repeating it back. What did you hear me say? What is it that you heard me express to you? And then it's okay, well, that is the words I said, but that's not what I'm meaning, because your experience is shaping what I'm even saying. So being really aware that that can happen, I think it's been super helpful and beneficial to bridging the gap between people who have such differing experiences. So I can see where all of this comes together and lends itself. And it's very similar to art. For example, somebody can look at a piece of visual art and see something completely different than somebody else, or get a completely different emotion than somebody else. So I think being aware of that when working and building trust is important. And if you're thinking that you are understanding, I always just say, can you, and I know Fred does too, can you expand? Can you expand it in a way, or give us a real life situation or something like that, so that we can understand the best that we can, even without experiencing it on the same level. So.
Yeah, no, I think, and again, in that overall conversation around art and healing, the more we can understand about ourselves, the better, I think, the better position we're in to be receptive to others and to recognize and to feel safe. That's a really, really important part of our being, right? Is being safe. Jamie, you spoke about the concept of spirituality, and as artists we use that in a non-religious setting. I mean, in my limited knowledge, because I'm sitting with a bunch of scholars here, but in my limited knowledge and understanding, the word spirit comes from the Latin word spiritus, which really means breath or to breathe, which is the one thing that we share in common. So when we talk about the insight approach, when we talk about creative ways to be curious, to understand, to feel, and create spaces where we can be in common space together, what is that common breath? What's the common breath, the common spirit, if you will, that Marnie, you kind of described it as, what's that breath of possibility? What is that space that can in creative ways manifest health and well-being for groups of people through, Jamie, as you have said, I have a brain, and this is how it works. I don't just have a head. There's a universe in there, and this is how that universe flows, and it's very, very, very much like breath and breathing. We sustain our lives through breath. Can we in healthy ways sustain our being together through more insight? Marnie?
So Jamie, do you want to go first and then I'll go?
If you'd like, sure. That's a great question, Fred. I love how you use breath as the sort of master metaphor for the spirit. I do think it's a metaphor, though. We do have, as you say, breath is the one thing we have in common. I would argue we also have consciousness in common. And they're not exactly the same thing, or not. I mean, metaphorically they may be, but not literally. They're not the same.
You're right. Yeah.
And so if I think about the insight approach, which tries to be empirical as well as as well as metaphorical, but mostly tries to be empirical. Think about what spirit means is that inside the flow of consciousness, there is an impetus, there is a tug, there is a push for self-transcendence. There's something in us that wants us to be attentive rather than inattentive. There's something in us that wants us to understand rather than get it wrong. There's something in us that wants to be true rather than false. There's something in us that wants to respond with love rather than contracted self-reference. There's something in us that wants to know the best option for what we want to do, not the first one, not the most limited one, to do the more responsible thing and to do it well. That tug, which we feel from time to time, and we mostly feel it like, oh man, did I screw up there? Oh, how could I have missed that? Or oh, is the absence of self-transcendence, the absence or turning away from the fullness of who we can be. And I think it's in the play of that, in the play of, and that's, you know, the fullness of the breath of our consciousness, if you like. It's taking a deep breath in the possibility of who we can be. And as we were talking earlier, and Marty was talking about culture, and I was talking about carriers, and Via was talking about the art she creates to do this for people. But there are ways in which there are certain carriers or metaphors, breath is one of them, that help us to pay attention to that pull, that tug, that elan. And I would say that that's not religious per se, that's natural, it's spiritual. And the great religious traditions of the world and the great secular traditions too pull on it in various ways. They pay attention to it. What the Insight approach tries to do is be explicitly careful about what is going on. And now all that's spoken by me, and I'm sort of a philosopher of consciousness and the spirit in that regard. But what the Ebb does, and what you do, Fred, is to not make people become philosophers before they can become spiritual, because we spontaneously are, and not make people become theoretic or having to master the stages on the loop before they know what an insight is, but to recognize that the flow of consciousness is like breathing. The flow of consciousness is like, if you think about it as experiencing and understanding and then deciding and then to figure out what to do and what's best to do. There's a certain narrative flow to the way our minds spontaneously work and our spirit is spontaneously tugged. And I think art is the natural language of that. And if we can become self-aware and what Marty, you didn't use critical, precise about what's going on in us when we're feeling and when we're moving and when we're choosing and when we're aspiring, then that becomes the power of fully breathing.
Great, beautiful, Marty.
So there's two things that I want to pull up on and pull out and weave into a different kind of narrative. So the first thing, Fred, was that you said that we all have brains. And I think, you know, that there is a difference between our brain and our mind. And a brain is kind of what Jamie was talking about in terms of the senses, like because we can see and we can hook up nodes to that. And it's different from mind, which is how we ask questions and what lights are, what's meaningful to us or what feels more expansive to us. And when Jamie talks about that as empirical with the insight approach, it's like paying attention to this consciousness that we have and that everybody has, and how do we do that? One of the things that I would offer really humbly, and I think having these conversations with scientists, like the natural scientists and the people at Johns Hopkins who are doing amazing work when I was looking at the website. But one of the things that really struck me is when they did a project on spaces that were healing and that what was more relaxing for people and where they felt most calm. And what sometimes people reported as the most calming environment was not what their body was telling them. And so then my next question is, so who's right? And how do we actually engage in a conversation about that? Because what are the things that can register on an MRI may or may not be relevant to a sense of who I am and what is best in the world and how I want to relate to other people. And how can the natural sciences register that? How can the arts actually challenge the scientists whose business is measurement? How can the arts challenge the science community in that way to be empirical in the magic of what happens between people, the harms that people can do with each other that may or may not register in an MRI, but certainly is experienced and felt and can be healed in ways through the arts. So those are some of my questions that I think are so powerful about the kinds of dialogues that you're hosting here, is that to have these really authentic two-way flows, and also even to acknowledge that with this profound conversation that's going on amongst many people within Canada and amongst the Indigenous communities, is that the medical community is not particularly well trusted for the instruments and the approaches that they have. And so that the way to actually be on a common ground of a conversation amongst natural scientists and the arts community is, it has a possibility of being very healing for the scientists and the artists in those communities in a way that goes much farther beyond what can be measured through an MRI and into what can be felt with the human spirit and the human mind, our consciousness.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Marnie. You're absolutely right. And we've actually seen instances where, our science and research colleagues are really, really moved, you know, through the engagement of art when their thoughts and ideas are encapsulated in the conversation. And I think that goes back to what Emma said. I think this conversation brings up to me something that we as artists can do to create a greater opportunity for people to understand the power of the insight approach and how the mind works, or even enter into that conversation. I would venture to say that in probably 90% of the engagement that I have as an artist in the world, and some of the work that we do with community engagement in communities, is that what music does or what theater does, I'll speak to music for a moment, is that um, music creates an experience of feeling. In other words, people will not argue with how they feel, and so I think it raises the artist's responsibility and opportunity to create experiences which enables people to feel. And then the other really important element that we deal with all the time is for an individual to feel like I'm heard and I matter, so that sense of, because then what happens is when one feels, and one really feels, they can speak, or they feel safe to speak, and they can see in your eyes, and they can feel in your presence, and they can feel by your conversation that they matter, that what they had to say matters, is a really, really important way of opening up, expanding that space, so that this conversation of not only do you matter, not only can you feel, but this is how you can understand that, more profoundly, and it will expand your heart, and again, I love to talk about that longest distance, the old mystical concept of the distance traveled between the head and the heart. I think as artists, one of the most important things that we can do is open a space for feeling, and open a space for being seen and heard and listened and sharing, right? And that builds a greater trust system where folk will then say, well, what more can I know? Why does this happen over and over again? What can I know, and what can I understand? And through the building of that knowingness and that understanding, it expands that energetic vortex that connects us to each other. And then that felt sense of spirit, that space that it's not necessary for us to fill or to understand, but just to be in, it's like that space between us. You know what I mean? It's like there's an energy here right now, although we're, hundreds and thousands of miles from each other. And so, that way of more fully understanding how to make meaning, that opportunity to open up the space so that we can share and we can really kind of inspire the mind and to want to know more, and then as artists to create or recreate examples or spaces where we can come together in and feel the oneness, the commonality of, yeah, I've said that, or, yeah, I felt that way, or wow, can that really happen? Again, that curiosity, that natural space that we abide in when we're children, before we settle into whatever, I got this, right? So to really be able to create those safe spaces is what we try to do here at the Straz Center, and to create greater accessibility and to be great listeners, and then to recreate or recreate. I've seen Taya do this just over and over and over again. I've had many, 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 many conversations with Dr. Price where he's asked me questions that have um, challenged me, and at the same time, awakened me to say, man, there's so much more to know and to consider. And then there's always those moments where, Emma says, have you drank any water? You know what I mean? So, that it's that building of community where we can create and recreate together, and that's healing. And that's the real healing essence of being. I feel so honored to have this opportunity to have this conversation. We could go on and on and on forever and ever and ever, but I'd like to finish up today by giving everybody an opportunity just kind of for a final thought. So we'll start with Jamie.
Well, Fred, my final thought is that it's wonderful that you pulled together this convening. It's always a pleasure to be with you and with Marnie and with Viev and Emma, and I'm just grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you. Likewise, my friend, Miss Viev.
The word that keeps coming to me when you were talking, Fred, was agency. And it makes me feel hopeful that there is an approach, there's a method, there are artists out there working, there are ways to make this emerge again, right? So that it's like the artist who waits for the muse and thinks, where are you? Or what's the practice? What's the method? What are the steps? What are the techniques that you use and do individually and together that are that reproducing, recreating, reemerging and emerging constantly? And it makes me feel very hopeful. So thank you for this conversation. All of you, Emma, thank you for hosting with Fred. And I just am very, very, very honored to be part of the Art and Mind Village chat community.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Marnie?
So I'm left with a feeling of gratitude and a sense of stillness and almost a sense of wonder about how can I listen more and wonder more and be more present to myself and others in a way that can open the possibility of healing and co-creation. How I'll leave that.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Emma.
Yeah, I think I'm just excited that we're continuing the conversation. And I know Fred and everybody here, this has been something that you guys have been working towards for a long time. So the fact that it's now really become a topic of conversation, and I think COVID kind of pushed that conversation just in general about mental health and wellness and how the arts can affect that has been, you know, one thing that has positively shifted. So I'm excited to see where the conversation continues to go.
Well, thank you, Emma. Well, our time has come to an end, but thank you so very, very much for this opportunity to come together. It was interesting in a lot of our conversations over the last several years, and I want to just really give kudos to Johns Hopkins for being willing to collaborate with us here at the Straz Center, and also kudos to our leadership here at the Straz Center, because we are really, really committed to this journey and this conversation about arts and health and how it can really grow and there can be more understanding. And in many of our conversations, a couple of things come up. One is that it's perceived and understood that, you know, when healing became a formalized art form, or, you know, when people began to heal, that was considered an art, you know, the art to come together and to heal. And also the fact that when we take a look at the most ancient of our cultures, and many, many cultures, there's no word for art, because art is an integral part of our being. And I think that our ultimate goal is to return to that understanding that creativity and art is an integral part of our growing and our knowing and our being together, and that that will help to be a foundation upon which we do together, what we create together, how we choose to be together. And quite certainly the inside approach and understanding. I mean, I will not forget this conversation about the mind and the brain. There's a song in there somewhere. I got to write that one. That's really, really powerful. Thank you for that. I'm going to meditate on that a bit. Marnie, thank you so very, very much for taking out time to be with us. Jamie, thank you as always, my friend, for being here and, you know, being a part of this. Viev, thank you to you. And Emma, thank you so very, very much for guiding us along. And thanks to all of you for your interest and your willingness to come and share some time with us here in the Art and Mind Village as we continue to explore, learn, manifest a wonderful new way, an ancient new way of being with each other, helping us to create and heal together the body, the mind, and the spirit. I'm Fred Johnson, and on behalf of the Straz Center for the Performing Arts and Johns Hopkins University, the Institute for Art and the Mind, we thank you for being with us. We look forward to being with you again. So between now and then, create, be happy, be healthy, take care. Bye-bye.
Amen.